Hello and welcome to the second part in our series on Moral Tribes by Joshua Greene. Today I'm going to be talking about the second section of the book, that being Morality Fast and Slow. So to start off with, we will go over trolleyology, which is a favorite of Joshua Greene's, as far as I can tell, and kind of makes up the crux of his moral theory. So we have two cases here, two of the kind of the two underlying cases that make up the rest of his theorizing in terms of contribution. Here we have a case. This is our little trolley. This is our track. The trolley is heading towards 5 people, and we're right next to a switch. And this is a pretty famous problem, so if I don't explain this very well, you probably already know what I'm talking about. Over here we have a single person. With the trolley heading towards those 5 people, we can choose whether or not to pull the switch, thereby killing one person by pulling the trolley to the other track towards the one person, or we can choose to not touch the switch or not pull the switch and have the trolley kill 5 people. Here we have a similar situation, but now we're up on a cliff. We have this little guy with a backpack. We're nowhere near the switch. This guy with the backpack, he's been hiking, and so the backpack is huge. It's one of those huge backpacking hiking bags. And so we're like, what do we do? The only two options are to 1, let the trolley go to the 5 people, or 2, push this guy off because somehow we know it's going to fall directly where we need it to go, and it'll stop the trolley but kill the person. We don't actually have this over here in this section. So these are two similar seeming situations intuitively, but as we'll see, psychologically they can be quite different, at least in the experiments that Joshua Greene ran in a laboratory environment. In this case, when asked, most people choose to pull the switch, something around 80%, if I remember correctly. So a large amount of people. So they choose to pull the switch, killing one person but saving 5. In this example, which we'll call the cliff example for our purposes, in moral tribes it's called the footbridge example because you're on a footbridge. But most people choose not to push the person off to kill that man but save 5 people. Instead, about 30 people choose not to save the 5 people in this case. Instead, they choose to refrain from pushing and watch it happen, you could say. And what Josh Greene did, and what he argues here, is that there are interesting neurological correlates with these two reactions that correspond to interesting philosophical principles. Whenever we push the switch, we pull the switch, we can see that our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex fires. The dorsolateral, I'll explain this first. When we decide whether or not to pull the switch or push the man on the cliff case, our ventromedial prefrontal cortex fires or is activated. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a sort of part of our executive function area, obviously, because it's in the prefrontal cortex. But in this case especially, it's really about reasoning. That's the whole point, is kind of objective, cold reasoning, as much as we can do that. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, for our purposes, allows input from emotional centers of our brain, like the amygdala and takes that into account when making decisions. So we can see when we have this kind of not quite dichotomy, but difference between the switch and the cliff case, that something's going on in our brain. In one case, we're being fairly cold and rational. In the other, we're a bit more emotional. And so that's interesting, obviously. And what Greene supposes is that initially, the switch case is impersonal, meaning that we have no contact. We are able to view our actions when we pull a switch to save one person and to kill one person and save 5. We're doing an impersonal action, and it's not our fault. That's the main thing. But when we push someone, we do view those actions as being personal, as intentional, and possibly as crossing, as what's the word? Well, someone has the right to be alive, and we're impinging on that right. So basically, Greene looked at this and said, very interesting. This is a very reasoned action. This is more emotional. This is also, we're thinking about the consequences of our actions, as in what our goal is to have the greatest consequence. We can either save 5 people or save one person, technically. So if we save 5 people, we lose one person. If we value everyone the same, then we've technically saved 4 people. If we if we don't pull a switch, one person is alive, but 5 people die. So technically, 4 people have died. Not necessarily our fault, although we have the ability to change that. So, or we could even say that because we have the ability to change that, that also produces some push in our reasoning to actually save the 5 people instead. But in this case, we can either kill 5 people or kill one person. That's how we view it. So we generally choose not to kill anyone as far as we can help it. And then we can say that it's not our fault. So what Greene decides is that when we pursue a impersonal action, we use moral reasoning and therefore come to a consequentialist judgment on those morals. But when we pursue a personal action, the process is intuitive and emotional, and we therefore use deontological reasoning. So maybe a quick rundown on consequentialism and deontological philosophy is in order. Greene switches a little bit whenever he talks about consequentialism in this book. At first, he generally refers to consequentialism, which is making ethical choices based on their consequences. He also talks about utilitarianism and switches the name up eventually to deep pragmatism, which is more about, you could say, taking everyone's happiness into account when you're making a decision so as to maximize happiness, which is, in my understanding, is that that's a bit different than utility exactly, but he calls it deep pragmatism anyway, so it's okay. So basically, he conjectures that when we make impersonal decisions, when a moral judgment requires impersonal actions, we tend to make consequentialist decisions. And when we make when a judgment requires personal actions, we use deontological decisions. Consequentialism is all about the consequences. Deontological philosophy or ethics takes into account duties and you could say rights. I think that's rights is the more important thing in moral tribes to Greene. And so here we can see this person has the right to be alive, to not be pushed off a cliff. So we tend not to do that. But here it's like, well, we can either kill 5 people or 1 person. Everyone has the right to be alive, but we have to make a choice. It's a bit, rights don't come into it as much. So with this, he formulates his dual process model of moral judgment. He uses a camera analogy quite often, and of course you can find him talking about this stuff on YouTube if you want a bit more of a better description, more organized description of his work. But he uses a camera analogy because we tend to use these processes in terms of system 1 and system 2 cognition. If you're not familiar, you might want to read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. It's kind of the pinnacle of dual process models of cognition. But system 1 is intuitive cognition, perceptions, emotions, very quick. You can not necessarily effortless, but not as effortful cognitions. So whenever I see a chair and it's black, I'm immediately like, that's black. Or if I see a good example might be if I see a cockroach, I'm probably going to be disgusted by that cockroach, even if it's not, well, it is disgusting, but there are also experiments where if you put a cockroach and sterilize it and then put the cockroach in like a glass of milk, then people still won't drink that milk because they'll still be disgusted by the cockroach even though they know it's sterile. And there may be arguments that maybe it's not so sterile. I'm not a cockroach biologist. I don't know much about cockroaches, but obviously very quick intuitive decisions can come into play for a lot of things. And generally we use heuristics, which is kind of a component of system 1 intuition cognition, to make most of our decisions in life. So all kinds of habits. I walk to school every day and use the same route every day just because that's easier for the most part, and also because I've thought through at one point whether or not that was the optimal path. But system 2 is more deliberate, effortful cognition, real reasoning that takes work. And usually that's kind of what we consider like cold reasoning, not as emotional. And so in his camera analogy, he likens the manual modes of a camera to system 2, and like the automatic mode of a camera to system 1. Because if you're like just kind of taking pictures, you don't really know what you're doing, you don't really know how to set everything right, maybe you use the automatic mode and it's good enough for a decent enough shot. You're probably not going to get anything spectacular, but you'll get something, and that's all you really wanted. But if you really kind of know what you're doing, if you really need to get the perfect shot, you might use the manual mode, which takes longer, it takes more effort, but if you do it correctly, you'll get a better result, hopefully. And so that's his camera analogy. And so this is kind of the underlying framework for this section is the underlying framework for really fleshing out the model, because he really kind of gets into utilitarianism or deep pragmatism and the implications, political implications, moral implications, because he does end up making normative ethical claims in the book. So hopefully this gives us kind of a launching off point for the rest of the book. So thank you very much. I'll probably do section 3 immediately after this, depending on how much time I have. But I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you next time.